Greetings all, Ferrari Man 601 here. We've had a really bad day. We have had a really bad day. Not just for any one particular team or any one particular driver, but we've had a really bad day for Formula One in general. Of course, I'm talking about what happened today in the Canadian Grand Prix. Those of you who have not yet seen the race, spoilers ahead, but quite honestly, I don't understand how any of you haven't seen the race or have at very least heard about what happened in this race, because it is all over social media. It is probably the biggest single storyline that I've seen break in the last 10 years of Formula One. Basically, we had a car finish in first place and not win the race. Last time that happened, 2008. Yeah. Let's talk about this. The Canadian Grand Prix, it had all of the makings of an absolutely classic state of affairs. Canada almost always throws up an interesting race, and of course now we're getting into the summer season, we're getting into the mature days of a Grand Prix World Championship. Typically, by the time we get to Canada, we're coming into mid-year, the pecking order is starting to really become solidified, and challenges to the pecking order are starting to manifest. And in 2019, the Canadian Grand Prix was no different in this regard. For the first time since last year, Ferrari was on pole in the hands of Sebastian Vettel. This was an absolutely necessary breakthrough on the part of Ferrari, finally, to prove that they can bring the fight to Mercedes and legitimately be in contention for a Grand Prix victory. Of course, all of the races in 2019 thus far, including today in Canada, have been won by Mercedes. However, it did not start out that way. Sebastian Vettel put the SF90 on pole and showed Mercedes, hey, you might have some opposition today. The race started without incident, effectively status quo up until lap 48 of 70. When Sebastian Vettel leading the Grand Prix over Lewis Hamilton after the pit stop, so Ferrari were legitimately ahead of Mercedes, Sebastian Vettel made a slight mistake, left the circuit at the first chicane, the first of three chicanes around the Montreal racetrack, took to the grass, gathered it back up, and rejoined the circuit. Sebastian Vettel did not damage the car, he did not make contact with the barriers, nor did he make any contact with the other car around him. The other car around him was driven by Lewis Hamilton. Of course, they were fighting for the victory, and Hamilton, he was closing on Vettel at this point. Hamilton had started to find the grip in the tires again. He initially looked like he went through an initial graining phase on that second set of tires after the pit stop, but he was starting to get a hang of it, and the grip was coming back, so Hamilton was closing that gap on Sebastian Vettel by a few tenths per lap. So gradually, Hamilton was reeling him in, Vettel trying to respond, and the Ferrari had the pace to respond. It was just that Vettel made a slight error, caught some oversteer into that first chicane over the lap, went into the grass, and rejoined the circuit. Now, typically, we wouldn't necessarily look at this as anything really to worry about. Yes, drivers do make mistakes, even elite racing drivers from time to time, and therefore, well, it was a mistake. Vettel got away with it, it would have seemed. However, a few laps later, it was announced that there was an investigation going on into Sebastian Vettel and Lewis Hamilton, namely for Vettel leaving the circuit there in that incident. At no time, to reiterate, did Sebastian Vettel make contact with the wall, nor did he make contact with any other cars, namely the car of Lewis Hamilton. However, after a few more laps of deliberation, of course all behind closed doors, as Formula One stewards always do things, it was announced that Sebastian Vettel would be receiving a 5-second time penalty to be served either at a pit stop or to be assessed after the race. As this was already on lap 48 of 70, there were no more scheduled pit stops planned for either Mercedes or Ferrari. Therefore, Vettel served that 5-second penalty at the end of the race, at which time 5 seconds were added to his total elapsed time. At the end of lap 70, Sebastian Vettel crossed the line, classified in P1, winning the Grand Prix. However, after the 5-second countback, Lewis Hamilton inherited P1, taking victory yet again in this 2019 World Championship. Those of you who are students of Formula One history will remember the last time that a car crossed the line in P1 and then did not get the Grand Prix victory. That was at the Belgian Grand Prix in 2008, and that driver was none other than Lewis Hamilton. So 11 years ago, Lewis Hamilton had to pay a penalty for this. Now, in the next time that a situation like that occurs, Hamilton is the beneficiary therein. Quite interesting. Also, for the record, the last time that happened, the driver who was gifted the race win after the fact was Ferrari's Felipe Massa. So the tables have been turned here to some degree. Ferrari gaining a win there and losing one here, and Hamilton losing a win there and gaining one here. Because there's a precedent with this, because this did happen amid similar circumstances for a car leaving the circuit and rejoining, because there's a precedent for penalties being assessed like this, I can't say that it was altogether surprising that this event occurred. However, what was quite surprising was the nearly unanimous condemnation of this action by the FIA on the part of all the commentators, at least the Sky Sports commentators. You had Martin Brundle saying that Vettel deserves no penalty, David Croft saying that Vettel deserves no penalty, Karun Chandhok saying that Vettel deserves no penalty, Jenson Button saying that Vettel deserves no penalty, and the list goes on and on. Those of you who are on social media, and of course if you're watching this video, you're on social media to some extent, but if you've been taking a look around at Twitter, you have seen none other than Mario Andretti saying, and I quote, "I think the function of the stewards is to penalize flagrantly unsafe moves, not honest mistakes as a result of hard racing. What happened at the #CanadaGP is not acceptable at this level of our great sport at F1. So, Mario Andretti, yes, the Mario Andretti, does not agree with this steward's decision. So that's two world champions, a very experienced Formula One driver in the part of Martin Brundle, Karun Chandhok, no slouch either, and of course David Croft, who's been a motorsport journalist for decades. Where exactly was the infraction? Where was the egregious infraction that Sebastian Vettel committed that warranted a 5-second penalty, a penalty which dramatically altered the results of what actually took place on the circuit when the checkered flag was flying? If you look at the video, and of course I'm not showing it here because the long arm of the law will say no. However, if you look at the video, Sebastian Vettel catches oversteer entering the second chicane. He counters for it, meaning that he applies opposite lock, which causes the car to go into the grass off to the left side of the circuit. He gathers it up in the grass, rejoins the circuit ahead of Lewis Hamilton. He then catches a second moment of oversteer, rejoining the circuit as the rear end of the car bounces over the inside face of the curbing on the left side of the circuit, which forces him to apply more opposite lock to gather the car up again. At no point did Sebastian Vettel make contact with Lewis Hamilton, nor the wall, nor anything other than the racetrack and the grass, both of which are in bounds if you're trying to recover an out-of-control car. Therefore, there was no deliberacy in this circumstance. It was not a case of Vettel trying to throw his car off the circuit so that he could lunge at Hamilton. There was no attempt at Vettel to slow down, to attempt to squeeze Hamilton against the outside barrier. There was no attempt by Lewis Hamilton to make contact with Vettel. Therefore, I don't see any maliciousness here with this circumstance, particularly from Sebastian Vettel's point of view. Arguably, Sebastian Vettel could have stayed over to the left to allow Hamilton a little bit more space, as Hamilton, seeing Vettel going off, had committed to go up the outside of that chicane, putting his car between Vettel's and the outside barrier, which of course in Canada is very close to the side of the circuit, and it is concrete and steel. So you make contact with that, your day is done very quickly, and it's going to be a very high-speed accident as well. The stewards apparently took that perspective, and they administered that 5-second penalty. Any racing driver who saw that and was able to voice their opinions today thought otherwise. Daniel Abt even taking to Twitter saying that the penalty was not warranted. He used much harsher language than I'm going to use here to describe what he thought. But racing drivers apparently are looking at this and saying, what did you expect Sebastian Vettel to do? It's not as if he can simply stop. The car was out of control at this point, and it's going to go where it's going to go. If anything, we should be happy that there was no accident here, that Vettel nor Hamilton made contact with any other cars nor the barriers, and both drivers were able to continue to the end of the Grand Prix. Apparently, the stewards thought differently and administered this very heavy-handed penalty. As far as what the fallout to this is going to be, of course, nobody knows at this point. We are still very fresh off of this. It's only a few hours away at the time of recording. I can say that the immediate fallout was absolute catastrophe as far as the Canadian Grand Prix was concerned. Within seconds of the stewards' announcement, social media absolutely exploded with tons of anti FIA, anti Formula One posts. Again, racing drivers started to take to Twitter to voice their disapproval. Fans all around the world, I saw people from 24 countries at least posting negative reactions to this. Of course, the commentary team from Sky Sports, of course, here in the United States, watching Sky Sports via ESPN, they were all unanimously not approving this. Everybody who had reached out to me on social media or on the Discord was absolutely incensed. Some people could see the rationale of the steward's decision, and I can see the rationale of it as well. You could argue that Vettel's car came into a dangerous position relative to the car of Lewis Hamilton, and there could have been an incident there, but there wasn't. And when we look at this incident in context, you get two world champions. The two most decorated drivers on the grid today are going wheel to wheel for victory in the Canadian Grand Prix. One is leading, one is attacking, one makes a mistake, gathers it back up, retains the lead, and the gap between those two guys closes, therefore increasing the chances that one of them is going to be able to overtake the other, and we're going to have an absolutely classic scrap on our hands for the win. That didn't happen. What is the one thing that everybody complains about today in Formula One? Overtaking. Here we had two world champions, 9 drivers' titles between two drivers. Again, the two most decorated drivers currently on the grid, two of the most decorated of all time, actually, on the grid, fighting with each other wheel to wheel for a Grand Prix victory. And the FIA steps in and says, no, you can't have that, fans. One of those guys did something wrong. Therefore, you can't see these two world champions go at it. That sends a message, first of all, to the drivers, saying that, well, if you're fighting, don't fight too hard, because we're going to think you did something wrong and take a win away from you, or cause you to concede positions, or take more points away, or some sort of penalty is going to be incurred by you because you fought too hard. Secondly, that sends a message to the fans saying, all right, we have an absolutely great battle going on for the first time this season. We're in round 7 of the 2019 season, and this is the first time that we have seen a real, on equal terms, wheel-to-wheel scrap between Ferrari and Mercedes. This was shaping up to be the first race this season that Mercedes didn't win. And the FIA stepped in and said, no, you can't have it, fans. Honestly, and I thought this same thing at the time in 2008 when Hamilton had his Belgian Grand Prix win taken away from him for a similar sort of infraction, rejoining the circuit after going off. That battle was, of course, with Kimi Räikkönen, who ended up crashing in the end anyway. It's absolutely deplorable that we have a situation in any racing series where the car that finishes in P1 when the checkered flag is shown doesn't get credited with the race victory. I understand that, on occasion, teams or drivers or both can do things that are so egregious that you may have the final result of a race challenged or overturned. I'm talking about in the cases of blatant cheating, technical infractions, things like that. But here, we had a driver make a driving error. This was not a deliberate act at all. He was fighting for a Grand Prix victory, and the guy behind him was doing the same. And he's penalized for fighting for a Grand Prix victory. To quote Sebastian Vettel, honestly, what are we doing? Is this racing? I'm not sure what we're seeing anymore from Formula One. I think we've come to a boiling point where the regulatory atmosphere in this sport outweighs the sporting atmosphere, where the regulations at this point interfere with virtually every aspect of the sporting enterprise that is Formula One. And it's gotten to a point now where drivers are now being discouraged from fighting for position. I know that sounds a little bit melodramatic, perhaps, but how else is one supposed to interpret what happened today? Two drivers were fighting for position. One evidently fought a little bit too hard, according to the FIA, and therefore he had his result changed. As far as I'm concerned, that's not sport. That's certainly not racing. If you're not allowed to fight for position, if you're not allowed to attempt to defend your position, if you're not allowed to make a mistake, that's not sport. That is politics. That is a political game where those in power are manipulating results. It's not a good day for the sport. It's not a good day for Ferrari. It's not a good day for Mercedes. It's not a good day for Hamilton or for Sebastian Vettel. It's not a good day for Canada. Their Grand Prix, one that many people look forward to, not only in Canada, the people who enjoy going to the race, but it's a favorite all around the world. It's a great circuit. They always put on a good show. We've seen some amazing results in Canada over the years. Think of 2007 with Hamilton taking his first Grand Prix victory, with Robert Kubica's huge accident there. The following year with Hamilton making a mistake and crashing out, and Kubica winning that race, his only Formula One win to date. It's a great venue. It's a great circuit. It puts on a great show all the time. But now its reputation has been well destroyed, quite honestly, simply because the stewards made a decision. Nobody deserves that. The Canadian Grand Prix doesn't deserve this sort of fallout. However, now their event is going to be remembered always for one decision made because one driver made a mistake in one corner. Honestly, when Formula One eventually folds, when the series ceases to exist, and given the current climate with virtually unchallenged domination by one team for 5 years now, and the regulatory atmosphere becoming more and more restrictive, and now becoming restrictive in terms of drivers defending positions and fighting for positions, the end of Formula One is going to be sooner rather than later. And when that day comes, today, the 2019 Canadian Grand Prix will be one that we talk about and we remember and say, that's the day the racing died. I do thank you all very much for listening. Ferrari Bound 601 saying thank you. And of course, we will see you soon.